At Limahuli Gardens in Kauai, I found a very complicated tree to paint. Limahuli Valley has been around for at least 1,500 years, and today it's one of the last easily accessible valleys with intact archaeological complexes, native forests, pristine stream, and the presence of the descendants of the valley's original inhabitants caring for it. The Screwpine is one of those trees you look at the top section, and it's very overwhelming to know even where to begin. Which is why these round forms really felt like an important structural element where all of that chaos would come together. They felt like little explosions in the context of the tree. I like that amidst all the utter chaos of the leaves, that there were these three forms that gave some direction within the context of this landscape. And of course, I got to the garden on the late side, which meant that my time to paint was super limited. I knew I was rushing as I went through this process. I'm typically super loose about my color mixing, and this just felt like a giant blob of greens and blacks that I had just mushed onto the surface of the watercolor paper. And that's really what this painting started out like, big piles of mush, puddles of paint that I pushed across the paper, moving pretty much starting in the upper left-hand corner, descending downwards, and eventually landing more so in the lower right-hand corner. This explosion of leaves with this brown bulbous form in the middle. With a subject like that, I just look for moments of tension to emphasize and then pull out different areas of yellow. The center is really where you see those points of tension. Those are areas that I would articulate with more crisp edges. When you go up and you see how they're all connected, there's so much tension, and that's what I'm trying to show. That center is also where you get very dark values. These leaves have this dramatic crease, and that's another moment, something like this, that I try to really show the shift of the brushwork. I guess I like the challenge of portraying utter chaos in nature. In terms of my brush technique, I really felt like I was almost scrubbing the surface of the page. I do like to start out my paintings fairly loose, but this was 10 times looser than I typically do. And the painting felt really amorphous for a very long time. That's not typical for me. I usually like to have a pretty firm structure set up within the first quarter of the painting. But I also knew, because the subject was so complex with all of those leaves, that it was fruitless to try to articulate leaf by leaf. I guess that was my way of justifying the big blobs of paint and letting the watercolor run in different directions. So when your subject is that chaotic, all you can really do is follow the directions of the leaves and noticing where they cross over each other. Those overlaps are extremely important because they create these conflicting diagonals throughout the composition, which is the key to showing that chaos. This painting stayed so blobby and so abstract for such a long time that I was genuinely alarmed when I left the garden, because I looked at my painting and it really looked like a giant blob. I don't think anybody who looked at the painting at the stage would have ever been able to recognize that it was something botanical. That's not a great feeling when you feel like all of that time and effort you've invested painting on site really didn't get you very far. It's probably the least amount of progress I have ever made on site on a plein air painting. And I really did question whether it was worth going back and trying to revive this dead blob of muddy greens. I did travel to Honolulu a few days later, where I didn't realize that these screwpines were everywhere. I visited other botanical gardens, and I saw some that were absolutely monstrous. I felt like encountering these screw pines in multiple places in Hawaii. I felt like I got to know them better. When you get to see a species in different contexts and you see the distinct personalities of each tree, but you also notice the similarities between them, the structure of the trees starts to make more sense to you. While I wasn't working on the painting, I was doing visual research there. I was observing these screw pines for several days, and that experience was really important in terms of me feeling like I could come back to this painting and resurrect it. I didn't have remotely enough time to work on this painting, and it's a big, blobby mess at the moment, but I may be able to fix some of those areas with some opaque acrylic paints. To me, the important thing about plein air is that you capture the feeling of being there. The accuracy is not important. Plein air is a moment. A lot of people worry that you don't have enough time to really finish a piece, but finishing a piece isn't important to me when I'm doing plein air. It's a fragment of that moment, and I let it be. It doesn't have to be remotely finished. I really never feel great because everything just feels like mush at this stage with the painting, but the groundwork is absolutely there. I was really rushed during this painting, which meant that I really didn't try at all to mix colors. I just blobbed together greens and blues, a little bit of red to get in some of that brown, but it was a big mess. Back in my hotel room in my pajamas, I managed to knock in many passages of white acrylic to pull out some leaves that would dramatically pop out of the composition. Those were important to establish first, so I felt like I actually had something I could hold on to. And then it was multiple passes of overlapping leaves on top of each other, which had varying degrees of transparency. I noticed the screw pines, the leaves have this sharpness to them. You go up close, they can prick you. That's when I jumped in with these dual brush pen markers, doing very sharp strokes to achieve that tension. The painting is starker than I think I would have liked it to be, but then I thought that perhaps that's okay, that I didn't capture how they really look in life, but that this is a way of giving the screw pine a personality. It's an evil screw pine, a dark and murky one that you don't want to walk into. There are plenty of parts of the painting that I barely touched, and a lot of that is to make the more contrasty, clear-cut, and detailed areas to pop. That mushiness is still there in a bunch of areas, but I'm hoping that it comes across as a mysterious mush that we feel we can sink into because of the moodiness of the value in colors.